Hello everyone, today we come back once again on the manorial system. I say once again because indeed it's a topic that I end up discussing rather often, more often than I should probably, because I see that not many people are interested, at least judging from the views. But it's if I say it today, if I speak about this today, I won't speak about it in another moment. So I believe that in this sense we can make first things first. Also because indeed the manorial system is a crucial topic. I'm not particularly interested into this, but the more I read about it and the more I realize its importance, and as always in my videos I'm rather driven by the acknowledgement that certain topics are not very discussed in popular culture. Like people talk about the Middle Ages as if they still lived into the pre-Raphaelite picture of that of those centuries, as if the Middle Ages was all about bloodsheds and brutality and all. I mean, or as if that was the really characterizing element of the Middle Ages compared to the other eras. And instead they completely ignore these socio-economical transformations that were really what made the Middle Ages in politics, into even into the military, because here we're not gonna talk about the feudal system proper, but you cannot understand how I don't know, the feudal system was born if you don't study the Curtis and the manorial system, the seigneurial system, how you want to call it. There are many ways. Um, so it's it. So today, I don't know if I'm gonna repeat myself on certain topics I've already discussed, but I would like to make just as always, let's say, only some points about the Curtis and the Dominicum and the Massaricium, that are kind of the element of the elementary parts of the manorial system. So, first of all, I would like to go a bit at the roots of the manorial system as in terms of land organization of property, patrimonial strategies, and all. Because for the sake of didactics, the sake of teaching, we like to stress that the manorial system was a sort of unique thing that you find just into the Middle Ages, and that qualifies the Middle Ages in this sense. But before the Industrial Revolution, indeed, if we look at any society in history, we're essentially talking about agricultural societies. And I say essentially in the sense that agriculture and the organization of the land and the crop rate and the revenues and all were really all set on this system. I mean, and the major political, social, and economical changes passed through how the land was distributed, how it was worked, how it was organized. So in practice, if you want to understand those societies, you necessarily have to look at the way they organized their land. And always keeping in mind that there wasn't really much else you could do. Sometimes I get very disturbed, euphemistically, let's say, because I read things like, oh, if the Romans had used the steam engine instead than slavery, they would have done the Industrial Revolution like in the ancient age. Yeah, I would have liked to see that, like how you could, with the the resource potential of the ancient world to waste an incalculable amount of resources to build steam engines. We don't know to do exactly what with them, while the whole society was starving just to produce that, and all the fault was about slavery. I mean, slavery was transversal in every society at the time, and if it was so, probably there was some reason. That is, that was the most convenient thing to do in absolute terms. I don't want to rationalize too much these choices, because even in the history of economics and of technology, um, we know that the homo economicus does not exist. I mean, humans do not make, actually they never make, we never make the perfect choice. But if a system works in that fashion, it's not because it's for the greatest part, because it's the most convenient thing to do. The ancient world didn't have the potential, it didn't have I don't know how to say that, but the system to really support different technologies aside from the forms of exploitation of the land. Slavery in itself wasn't this, this huge force, aside from the countryside, in the sense that, yeah, it is true, we see things like some of the greatest monuments of the ancient world that we believe most of the times were built by slaves, even though it is not true. The great Egyptian pyramids weren't built by slaves, but by salaried workers, as the Roman Empire was built on slave work, but even there, if you need to build something like the Colosseum, you can't make it simply built by an unknown slave with no sort of craftsman's skill, and pretending it maybe just for the heavy works, yes, but in absolute terms, slavery was something more used definitely for agriculture as well, just like in among the Romans, among the Germans, among basically every society. And it was still agriculture. So if you see where slaves were employed, they were employed where they were convenient to be employed, not because someone decided in an X point of history that now we have to use slaves, and everything that exists in terms of technology, well, who cares, because we have slaves, and we have necessarily for no reason use slaves. No, that was the system at that time because it was the most convenient point. For how crude it can sound, they had the means to do that. They had the mean to exploit other people, and they did it. And the achievements of the Roman Empire, or as any other great civilization, were obtained through slave work. But it's simply ridiculous in technological terms to pretend that those societies could do something more than agriculture. In practice as a structural system, and that the reason why they didn't go past that was slavery. Because it's not a surprise that the Industrial Revolution happened in 18th century England. It's not that someone reinvented magically the steam engine and it was used. Throughout all times, steam engine was known since the ancient times, but it's only at the time into which a country like England had such a gross exceeding surplus of resources from its that is cotton, essentially from India, that someone began to say, okay, this is becoming too much for using working force, let's use and invest into machineries. But the reason why it was possible to do that was that the rest of the technology was already advanced to the point that society could sustain that technology in practice. And all the components that were needed for a steam engine to work, a steam engine of the 18th century, were product of a society that already could produce them, differently from the one of the ancient world that didn't have that, simply because it didn't have the amount of wealth that was necessary to achieve that, and you can't simply see it, from any evidence like economical studies that exist, um, how that the real potential of agriculture actually was something that couldn't be elevated um, from um, from what it was in pre-industrial times, if not through those means that eventually triggered the Industrial Revolution, that weren't really cultural, but they were structural in greater part. So in terms of the difficulties that the ancient world had faced um, into the crisis of the late antique era, we find a different management of the properties. And this was really a moment of shrinking, in the sense that we know that the ancient world, how socially complex and rich as it had been, from during, I don't know, the Hellenistic era, the early Roman Empire was declining. It wasn't something so immediate, or you don't have to get this idea of decadence that is such a stupid stigma attached to those societies in the late ancient era. But it's undeniable that was a less availability of resources in terms of agriculture, consequently of people. There were wars. The main thing that eventually caused the greatest collapse was the plague that really wiped out. The greatest plagues happened since the time of the Antonines, but the biggest one has been the one of Justinian. The one of the Antonines, seemingly was bubonic plague, but we don't have a concrete evidence of that, while the one of Justinian was a smallpox epidemics. But it's not really all. It was a complex of factors that eventually caused this regression. So we're talking about a world that in this contracted mostly, and especially into the great centers. We're talking about the cities that were the ones that lived, that had emerged thanks to the exactly to that surplus that existed in the ancient world, and complexively there were still small things compared to the rest of the countryside. For instance, the Roman Empire was an empire of cities, but still, like in any other pre-industrial society, the wide majority of the people inhabited the countryside, and those cities could live exactly because of the countryside, like always again in pre-industrial societies. So the first one of the major dynamics that occurred during the decline of the late antique and the early Middle Ages was, and relatively to the early Middle Ages, yeah, it also depends on which Middle Ages you're talking about, because Britain is not Italy, Spain is not Germany, and all. But the um, there was definitely a degradation of some sort that was translated into the decline of cities and into a sort of agriculture. I don't know how to say that, but I mean people came, especially aristocracies, those who had the largest capitals and all, and were more deeply intertwined with the major political and economical events, kind of abandoned cities at a point because it had become inconvenient. There is no point in maintaining clients if these are not enough to make you become richer in the city if the city has declined. There is no need to keep the great infrastructures functioning if there is not enough people who can serve. Think about aqueducts or roads. I mean, those were structures that were regularly maintained. They had a cost, and if at a certain point the population of a city decreases at the point that local aqueduct basically doesn't serve to anything, because maybe the local rivers are enough just for satisfying the needs of the population. Nobody invests in that anymore, and instead the great mutton, let's say, into which to invest was definitely the land. By the way, as it had practically always been, in the sense that even the ancient clienteles didn't really work through, a magic energy that was created into the cities. It was still the urban aristocracies, the senatorial aristocracies were still the great landowners, who in this sense gave a part of their wealth to the cities, because the cities were the practically the sorting point for the great international traffics, because of their strategical, their logistical value. So once those traffics are contracting, because there is the plague, because the Arabs arrive, even if this is Piran's thesis, which there was really no stop of traffics when the Islamic invasions occurred. They were already they had already massively declined before, and the aristocracies decided to go back living into the countryside. Living into the city was indeed also a risk, because cities were a place where a lot of wealth was concentrated, and usually the invading armies were quite eager to sack them, even though even the countryside has always been obviously raided and destroyed, also because it was not fortified, so maybe the cities in part retained an advantage. But the idea that economy had to come back, I mean the management of the properties had to come back on the land proper, so in the place where the business can really be managed directly, is something that starts existing since the late antique times, and that eventually gave origin to the manorial system. So you have to imagine this huge late antique latifundia estates being populated by literally armies of slaves, and who were quite harshly treated, by the way. Not extremely much. It wasn't probably like a concentration camp of Auschwitz, but we know that there was a level of exploitation that probably wasn't even too distant from that. Because I say this because sometimes I hear things, oh well, but slaves were not treated all that bad. Well, of course, if you're talking about an educated slave that has to teach, the future emperors about Greek, about literature and all, in the imperial school, yeah, thanks to my eyes, you invested in that slave exactly to do that. But if it is just a guy that is called basically an instrumentum vocalis, that is basically an instrument that is different from a tool that is just like all the others, except for the fact that he talks, and you're making him work in times of economical contraction to make more and more money, as much as you can to recover the losses, and you and all the ways you can treat him to make him work. Well, it's probably not going to be treated exceedingly well, still well enough to keep working. mm, But also, finding someone else replacing him would have not been extremely difficult, even though definitely during the late antique times, um, the shortage of manpower was definitely also an issue. And in this sense, it's much more likely that slaves in the Roman latifundia were treated much, and I say much, worse into, say, the early imperial times than the late ones, because at that point a slave, as a human life and as a working force, was considered probably more precious than it had been at the times when the Romans just conquered everywhere and and brought back literally hundreds of thousands of slaves with whom they probably not even knew what they could do in practice. And usually there were certain say corporals, like the Villici, or the Auctores, that were these figures. Some of them were originally slaves themselves, and we know that these administrators eventually mistreated the same slaves that they had been, by making them work harder and harder, like a sort of um, um, revenge against their miserable existence. Um, and yet there were also there was also and this happened on the the let's say the central the central villa in practice, where the master, the Dominus, was living, and in which he could control business more directly, and where he had his own slaves. Then there were other lands that were instead rented by the Dominus, into which free, or semi-free, demi-free, telling the truth, colonists were to work. You know that from the time of Diocletian, basically the peasants become um, um, tied to the land, and they even as a familiar tradition. So basically, you had to keep living there. Um, and in the Diocletian and Constantinian reforms, in this sense, were adapting to the different times, to different economical reasons that tended to frame really the Roman population into certain fixed roles that had to be maintained, in a picture of perpetual order that started from the imperial to the imperial throne, to the last slave of the empire, as a sort of perpetual sanction, and that it was conceived to strengthen the structure of the empire. And already at this time, and these peasants were obviously working around, therefore over the land of a dominus. So the old free um, peasant of the golden days, let's say, of the days of glory of the empire, didn't practically exist anymore. The middle class had basically declined irreversibly throughout all the 3rd century. They basically disappeared, and they became peasants, low classes, so a huge amount of poor people and a fewer very wealthy guys at the top. And therefore the land had been progressively bought by all these free people, excuse me, these aristocrats, who in this sense had built huge latifundia that had choked almost any form of independent freeman land administration. So this basically set the already a quite important premise for the manorial system, because in a way or in another, the land in certain parts of Europe, especially the one that were more had been more intensely Romanized, basically all belonged already to a master of some sort, and even freemen, not just slaves, were basically tied to that, because there would have been no other place to go work with the crisis uh, of the cities and of crafts and all. And these big estates were called ville, singular villa in Latin, and so there were kind of great agricultural companies in practice, with huge patrimonies under the possession of single owner, and it was already basically divided in two parts. So um, the reserve of the owner, of the Dominus, we can say the patron in practice, that was directly managed, as we were saying, and very extended. By the way, it wasn't just a place where the master, the Dominus lived, but also it could extend. And a series of much smaller estates that were instead given to singular peasant families into concession. These families were relatively autonomous at this time, but they were in this sense already tied to that land. So there is also less marked mobility of communities, and this favored practically the concentration and the unity of the concentration of lands, and the unique management for the sake of simplicity and even of economy in practice. Um, and there were obviously certain intendants of the master that kept watch on these families, because they had to these families had to pay the revenues that were owed to the owner. So this system basically passed into, especially into the former Roman Europe, into the early Middle Ages, into the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. And I'm insisting on this Roman tradition because obviously the Roman Empire was made up by this land organization. Estates were present only there in practice. Where the Roman Empire had not expanded was the area into which basically these land and very big estates couldn't practically be built. I already hinted many times in my videos about this. I mean, the idea that stopping to the Rhine and to the Danube was stopping basically because beyond that you couldn't sustain a sedentary life for environmental reasons, for technological reasons, and that's the same reason for which basically the Germans were semi-nomadic at the time. Those were lands that eventually fully sedentarized much later, and therefore what was the point of even of invading them, of trying to keep them directly? It was enough to have legions on the border and to try to keep those guys down, as long as economy allowed you to deploy enough troops to contain them. But in those areas instead, that were I mentioned the Germans, but this could be said also for the Celtic Europe that had stayed out of the Roman Empire or other lands. um, there was much more the idea of the single freeman property, which was actually something pretty meager. You don't have to think of that like the ideal world of the pure guys that lived free from the Roman tyranny, because what they did was essentially doing the same exact thing. The problem with their neighbors, with even within themselves, but simply they lacked enough resources to maintain something that was larger than a village. And they couldn't maintain stocks to set up something larger. And when they began to do that, especially with the development of cattle, the expansion of villages, but usually from the late antique times, this seems to occur in the 4th century Germany, but it was something very timid. You see that the freeman society is basically weakened in favor of the rise of aristocracy. So this is as pretty good, which already existed before, by the way, and would just increase in their power, which is a pretty good witness of how humans tend always to prevaricate each other, and that there are no good or bad people in the world, but just humans, and already only trying to understand how we work is something would be something great. So the so into the Middle Ages, basically, this division between the directly controlled property of the lord and the other free peasants that were working on by renting other owners' properties, basically translated itself into the manorial system. The villa became essentially the curtis. At least the curtis is a term that, telling the truth, is used especially into Italy. In northern France, it was the secondly most advanced area. The term villa keeps remaining in use, which is interesting because actually the term villa was born from Italy, from the Italian villas, in fact, but it was maintained more into France. Maybe one day we will explain why even this linguistical differentiation. So the here it was the splitting between the Dominicum that was managed by the Villicus, there was an administrator chosen by the Dominus, and the Massaricium. That was surveilled by the same Villicus, but made up of the so-called mansi, from which the Massaricium actually takes the name. The mansus is this kind of small farm in practice that made up even the same land unit of those times, although it could vary really. There could be very smaller and bigger mansi in practice that were instead managed by the Massari. And by and by their families, and the Massari is I don't know what's a fitting translation for it. It's the guy who works on the mansus, basically, or you can call it as estate manager, but for early medieval times, estate manager is pretty too much resounding. The Villicus was the real estate manager in its figure as the man of the man of trust of the owner. There is another point, a last point that I would like to make this evening, relatively to the actual spatial dimension of the curtis of the manorial system. There is, this picture. I mean, sometimes if you take a manual of medieval history and you get basically the chapter on the manorial system, you have these small drawings into which you have this illustration with patches of land that seemingly gravitate all around a core that is the manor, the curtis or villa as you want to call it, and then all the all around the attached the various mansi, and then maybe in the outer part the like the pastures and forests, and that were still parts, by the way, of the property. Sometimes they were public, telling the truth. Other times they were progressively taken by the local lord. And it's a kind of very idealistic term in cartographic or geographical terms, in the sense that these curtes, that is the plural of curtis, were actually pretty irregular in form. Some of them were not even continuous, spatially speaking. They could, and especially the massaricium, so the part that was eventually rented to others, was in this sense, it could be far away from the Dominus latifundium. Mm? And could extend really for even in other places, in, I don't know, in other valleys, or maybe there were forests in the middle, and all this stuff. So never think of the manorial system as something that eventually translated itself into compact dominations. If you're a lord, probably you want, if you are an owner, you want your properties to be close, because obviously it takes less to manage them. You can control them better. You can I mean, sometimes you can get kind of it can kind of backfire, because maybe if the Vikings or the Hungars and the Saracens arrive into your concentrated land that it took so many generations to build up, and they raid it all, and they pillage it and they burn it down, it's gonna be a pretty tough thing. But if you have more distant properties, maybe some of them can survive. But this is kind of a catastrophic reason for explaining why these properties were scattered. I know that people are so fascinated by the idea that at a certain point during the second invasion, some terrible people arrived and destroyed. There is this gloomy, dark picture of the Middle Ages, of finessed by foreign invasions, and they definitely happened. But actually the main reason why these properties were also scattered was in practice that, especially in the more into the wealthier into wealthier areas of Europe, because these properties were actually built piece by piece through purchasing. You don't have to think the lord just accumulating lands because he conquered them from someone else. If you were a lord that inhabited, like, I don't know, in Lombardy or into northern France or somewhere else where there was a lot of wealth going on, well, you could definitely conquer a land if you had especially a nasty neighbor or someone you had the chance to take out in that fashion. But being already part of the elite, it probably meant you had already enough money. enough purchasing means, and that you could simply buy a new land. We know, as a matter of fact, that especially in northern Italy, the curtes meant even in terms of encastelled lands. I mean, therefore, um, say estates that were dominated by a castle, by a moat. Sometimes these moats were actually being built eventually to be sold, not to defend yourself from someone, because probably, well, this is kind of gets more complicated, because theoretically there was still public power that was entrusted with defense. So uh, in practice, either you sold that fortification or not. Um, Probably that fortification would have been still defended, because it didn't even matter to whom it would belong. It belonged when the raids arrived. Who controlled it was probably enough economically tied to the local economy to protect through that castle everyone around, or at least those who were more convenient to protect. But in practice, what you see is that properties, even usually monasteries, have left enough sources about this, because they were those who actually were more educated and also very wealthy and powerful entities, and they definitely showed that the whole thing passed also through purchasing new land. Maybe it was a new land some, I don't know, 30 miles away, that was not contiguous to your villa. In practice, especially, well, it doesn't matter. You can obtain that. Maybe you can sell that eventually, and with those money buying something that is closer. So it already happened in this way, and this happened actually at a very early stage. Even since the 8th century, we have enough resources into, especially in Lombard Italy, of this, where the middle classes were actually more, were wealthier. They normally did that. They exchanged properties. They split them in testaments. They sold them. Maybe they gave them part. They gave them part to the church. Then the church could inherit that. If it was too far, it couldn't be controlled. It could sell the land to someone else and getting the money. It is all really how this happened. So in this sense, it was obvious that the the property, how it was, in the way it was organized, uh, responded to logics that went really beyond the mere spatial reasons, or at least that were framed into a much more complex system. And so it is. And for now, I stop, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel to receive further news about my contents. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.